Welcome to the Manitoba Ag Days podcast, where we hear from some of the most relevant, up-to-date, informational speakers in our industry. In episode 21, Todd Walker, partner, Frontier Drainage Systems, Aaron Hargreaves, a producer at Harwest Farms LP, and Jeanette Callier, Senior Water Resource Officer at Manitoba Sustainable Development, share their story about tile drainage.
I'll now introduce our panel for the Tile Drainage 101 portion of this morning's show. We have three esteemed panelists here who have related but different perspectives on tile drainage in the province. And so I'll conduct the introductions now so I don't miss out on them later. Each will have some content to offer in the way of some slides, and then we'll have the free-for-all, so to speak, with you folks in the crowd. So I'll begin by introducing Todd Walker on your left, the audience view to the far left. Todd is a partner with Frontier Drainage Systems. He grew up on the Walker family farm west of Souris and graduated from the U of Manitoba's agriculture program in 1984. After farming for some time, he joined Redfern Farm Services in 1995 and managed the Souris branch along with input purchasing for the company in later years. Frontier Drainage Systems was formed in February 2014, and the company has been offering mapping, designing, and installation services in tile drainage ever since. He is also the Western Canadian District Manager for Quarry Seed, and Todd is married to Christy and has 3 grown children. In the middle, we have Aaron Hargreaves, who's a neighbor of sorts to Todd, loosely using that word. Aaron farms just south of Brandon in the Souris to Wawanesa area. He grew up just on the north side of the Brandon Hills. He's married to his wonderful wife, Nicole, and they have 3 rambunctious young boys between 4 and 7 that keep them occupied when they're not farming. His partners and he farm 15,000 acres, growing corn, soybeans, edible beans, canola, and wheat. And they have been installing their own tile since the fall of 2012. And finally, closest to me here, farthest right to you, is Jeanette Callier. She is a Senior Water Resources Officer with Manitoba Sustainable Development, the drainage and water control licensing portion of that department. She obtained a diploma at Keewatin Community College in Natural Resource Management and more recently completed the Overholt School of Drainage, tile drainage training sessions. And Jeanette is a curler, so if you're looking for any insights into Manitoba's chances at the Scotties, perhaps she'll have some input on that, or maybe some tips on keeping your intern going the right way. So we're going to start with a bit of an introduction by yours truly, and this is something Jeanette and I agree, along with our interdepartmental tile drainage working group that we've established with various provincial departments, that we need to establish a consistent level of understanding, even at a modest level, and with any audience really, because water management affects everyone fundamentally in society. Some know more than others, so it's important to establish a baseline level of understanding, and that's what we're trying to do with our extension efforts. So to begin, what does tile drainage accomplish? What is its purpose? It removes excess water from the surface and soil profile of a field that looks like that. And as a soils guy, I'm keen to show at least one soils profile during this time at the mic. And this enables a grower to manage the level of the shallow water table within that soil profile. And it's about reducing stress to the crop, as you can imagine with that picture of puddled water on that field. And what the tile drainage is intended to do is to restore or maintain the crop's growth environment, a favorable environment for it to do the best it can following a major influx of water, too much water in that root zone, and tile drainage is meant to address that stress. One concern that arises with this notion that if it's removing this excess water, is there a possibility it'll take too much with it? No, because the influence on the water table extends only to the depth at which the tile is placed. And therefore a tile network will not make a soil drier in a dry growing season, because it can only affect the soil profile to that depth. So what are the drivers that are motivating the adoption of this practice, or at least for many farmers considering it? Because it is a fairly pricey investment. Well, of course, there's a shot of my brother's field where he's taken a biological approach. By contrast, he's established a deep-rooting perennial crop to try to dry out the land, but sometimes more intensive management is needed, an engineering approach, and that's where tile comes into play. Just for a quick bit of background, these are crop insurance numbers, and all I want to draw your attention to is the fact that from the mid-60s to 2005, excess moisture was responsible for a sizable portion of claims, and the same is true, and if not more so, in the more recent interval. And so this is what indicates the interest of farmers individually, and of course to the province as a whole, considering the importance of crop insurance. Some practical reasons for farmers, what would be the incentive, especially for a non-agricultural crowd? These are some of the fundamentals that other folks in society aren't necessarily aware of, and this is depicting with some of our departmental data the implications for yield potential for a given field based on seeding date. The sooner the seed goes in the ground, generally speaking, the better the prospects for yield. So if tile can enable field access earlier in the year, and that goes to, in 2016, there'll be farmers saying that tile drainage and other measures would help at harvest as well in a wet year like that. That's the purpose of trying to manage water, is to simply allow access to the field for the farming to occur. This photo is courtesy of PLS Land Solutions as an example of, as you can probably guess, fields tiled and not tiled, and this is the kind of evidence that convinces farmers to make the investment. Further to that, courtesy of Bruce Schufelt and his engineering consulting company, PBS, here's an example from the Homewood area. The alternative, of course, is going to be moving the water by some other means, and often that can be a rather crude measure and look pretty unappealing and have some impacts on the quality of that field, and that's what these photos depict. In addition, tile drainage can address a soil quality constraint, and that's salinity. Too many soluble salts in the profile limit the ability of the crop to take up water, kind of like me being desperately thirsty after enjoying salt on my fries. The problem for the crop is the water may be there, but has trouble taking it out. And these figures show the progress from 1995 to 2011. So this doesn't happen overnight, but with tile drainage encouraging more downward movement of water, and because these salts are soluble, if they exist on the field, if they are a problem, this could be an additional reason for the farmer to make the investment to improve the quality of that soil, and that has implications for production and possibly for the environment as well. So this is courtesy of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, a study done some time ago. And so with that, I'll leave you with a few photos here of how we're trying to put this into a broader perspective, especially to a non-agricultural audience. We know that agriculture has impacts, be it a flooding risk downstream or water quality, but human activity generally does, and we all need to eat. And in order for the economy to be maintained and for environmental sustainability to be achieved, we have to recognize some realities, and that is that one way or another, the water is going to flow. The reason we have a thriving agriculture industry here for the last century, really, is because of surface drainage, as depicted in the photos there. So it's not as though tile drainage is introducing something new. It's offering an alternative pathway for excess water to go. And that's the only way that a good crop is going to be grown, is if that water is managed. The key question now is how do we manage it, and how does tile fit into the overall system? And speaking of that, I'll touch on some of the hydrology here. The tile, as I mentioned, is providing an alternate route for the water to flow. It'll only flow downward to the tile when there is that excess moisture, when the soil is at saturation. So that's at the far left, and then gravity will take that water down. If it's at what's called field capacity, roughly the sweet spot for the right amount of water, and certainly when it's very dry, that water movement isn't going to occur. It's only when there is that excess. And similarly, in this photo, also courtesy of Bruce Schufelt, is indicating really the concept that it's when the water is too much for the soil to absorb, it will run off unless there is something like tile in place to encourage it to move down. So this is the fact. The water will move, or of course the farming won't happen. So if the water is going to move, now we have a choice of a sort. How much will move along the surface with very little buffer time in between versus moving down? And that's part of the explanation here with this slide, also courtesy of Bruce Schufelt, to depict to you what's happening. The soil is saturated at some depth, and the water table is established at a given point in time. It may be there at one point, and then, we have huge rains in the spring, maybe not long after spring snowmelt, which is, of course, a major phenomenon here in our cold climate. And so what's the implication? Well, with that saturation, the water appears at the surface, and now we have the impact on farming, on crop production. And so how can that be? Of course, then that leads to the runoff. And so how could tile drainage mitigate against that? Well, by introducing the tile, as I mentioned earlier, the water will flow down to the depth of that tile. That's excess moisture, and then travel out via the tile, and now the tile has established a new water table. Of course, eventually, later in the growing season, there's another force at work, and that is the crop, and through these processes, the water table will actually drop below the level of the tile, and now the tile really isn't part of the mix any longer because there's a stronger force at work, and that's the suction of the crop. In terms of some factors, as with any other practice, tile drainage doesn't necessarily have a fit in every field and every farm. There are economics involved too, but in terms of resource factors, the land comes into play, as you can imagine, and then that's my illustration, a little out of order here, I should say. Once that crop is growing vigorously later in the season, it acts like a pump and draws water out and will drop the water table even below the depth of the tile. Here's a caution regarding anyone considering any management decision, but it's certainly something like tile. We're encouraging through our interdepartmental working groups, extension efforts, that information rules as usual. We want knowledgeable people making knowledgeable decisions, and we're suggesting that, as with any other management decision, this is not a one-size-fits-all proposition. Site-specific information is critical, and it may turn out that a certain tile spacing is very common in the province, but it doesn't mean that it fits in every scenario. And so we're encouraging farmers to learn as much as they can, to have a constructive relationship with the installers and other folks like ourselves, to ask the questions, well, is this the right kind of tile design for my farm? Should it be, or this field, should it be the same as my neighbor's or a previous field? There are options. In terms of implications, water quantity, one of the potential benefits of tile is that it enables the soil to serve better as a place to store water, at least temporarily. It will move. It's not in the range of months, but it creates an opportunity to take advantage of that storage space in the profile, and it's not then just about volumes, it's also about timing. It could have the potential to reduce or delay the peak flow, which otherwise immediately begins, because what's the alternative? It's surface flow when there's too much water for the system to handle. So it provides essentially a buffer effect. And the conditions prior to the precipitation are going to be critical to determining how much of that. In terms of outcomes, this is an example from modeling done south of the border, but it is relevant here because it's for a similar soil type. Those are some of the desirable outcomes that we can expect with tile, and that's part of the incentive. There's a bunch of numbers here. I'm not going to burden you with a short course in tile drainage here. I'm just going to hit a few highlights. This is from a modeling exercise using 100 years of climate data on a similar soil type by a professor south of the border who's well experienced in this subject. And what it's showing here is that the drainage coefficient, for instance, moving down in that table as the drainage becomes more intensive. What are the implications? Well, we would expect to see more infiltration, so water moving into the surface, moving down through the soil profile. That means less water available for runoff and evapotranspiration. The tile water flow, of course, it's installed, so there will be tile water flow. Those numbers go up with more intensive drainage. Runoff, surface runoff numbers would then logically go down because it's a water balance concept. The water has to go somewhere, so it's a subtraction or a sharing kind of equation here. And yes, overall water yield has the potential to go up, but it's even at the most intensive drainage regimes, it's not 50, 100%. It's more like 12 to 15% overall increase in water yield that we could typically expect, at least for a soil of this type. So there's one example, and then of course we've got the crop yield incentive to the farmer. More stable yields and maybe not so much increased yields, but reduction in the loss of yields that would otherwise occur with excess moisture. And so we need to recognize that, and we do this in our extension all the time, that we've got different regions in Manitoba. That's what makes farming here interesting, and talking dirt with fellow dirt nerds like me, and those like Jeanette that we're trying to convert, to appreciate that we do have quite a varied landscape, and that's why we're encouraging site-specific information in terms of making the assessment of the suitability of this practice. Okay, Scott, we're ready to switch over. These slides are for later when we come to Jeanette's portion of the content. Thanks for your attention for the introduction. I'm now going to call upon Todd Walker to give the installer's perspective on tile drainage.
Pardon me? That's correct. So is that... So good morning, everyone. It's nice to see the turnout for the session on tile drainage. It's great to see. As mentioned, I am from Souris, and I live there with my beautiful wife, Christy. And I have a very strong passion for ag and innovation, and from my time in the retail business, I was always trying to do something better for my customers, always looking for the next angle to make them more profitable, which led me into my position with Corey Seeds as Western Canadian District Manager for Corey Seeds. And in that connection, I found my partners who were as passionate about innovation and ag as I was. And that's when we started our company, Frontier Drainage Systems, in February of 2014. So during my travels in Saskatchewan and Manitoba with my work, I've heard a lot of misconceptions from growers and just people in general about tile drainage. So by the time today, when us three speakers are done with you, you will be able to leave here and understand the benefits of tile drainage and actually how to unlock your field's potential. Does anybody know what the actual definition of a tile drainage is? Well, tile drainage is a system of subsurface pipes that lower the water system effectively and keeps the water table at the proper level. Sorry, my notes on my screen aren't popping up here, so I gotta look at my notes on here a little bit sometimes. So we're gonna get into the benefits of tile drainage, and as mentioned by Mitch, tile drainage removes excess water effectively. You're earlier into the fields in the spring, so when you have your snow melt in the spring, generally your tile fields are the first fields you get on to do your sowing. Same thing during your spray season. If you get the rains, again, your tile fields are generally your first fields you're on to get your spraying done. And even in a wet harvest, the fields that are tiled are the fields that you're on generally to get your harvest off first. As well, the profile becomes just more arable and breathable. It becomes like a big sponge absorbing the surface water as it moves into the profile. Soil compaction is reduced, and so the nutrients from above now filter into the profile, so it helps conserve your inputs that you put on the surface because they're now filtrating into that profile to be used later by your plant roots. As well, your salinity levels are greatly reduced, so you get improved root penetration into the soil profile. Again, that'll grab your moisture and nutrients as you need it during the growing season. So again, you get increased yield. Peak flow runoffs on your surface are reduced by at least 20 to 40% due to that sponge-like profile that you have now in your profile from the tile to the surface. This is a picture that was taken south of Winnipeg in the very heavy clay soils. So this particular field was tiled in the fall, and this is the first crop the next spring, and it's soybeans. And as you can see on your right, I believe that's your right? Yeah. On your right, the great root development that's right above the tile, and you can see the increased nodulation as well on that plant. So right away, even in the first year, you'll see an increased yield. The plant on the left was a plant taking in between the space of the lateral lines. So as you can see, it depends on soil type and how fast that will start to work in the system for the whole plant growth to increase yield. This is another picture that was taken from a client sprayer. This field was tiled in the fall of 2014. These pictures were taken in June of 2016. And this is a canola field. And as you can see, the pronounced growth above the tile lines. These pictures were taken 2 weeks apart, so you can see how the growth has spread in just 2 weeks in that very saline area. This grower in 2017, which this last year, he had soybeans on this field, and he said now that whole saline area was covered with plant growth. The soybeans were stunted, but he said that it's amazing to see, and just from 14 to 18, how the plants now had covered this area and the salinity was reduced, and just shows how tiling is really one of the best effective ways to reduce the salinity in your soils, to improve yield, and to reduce input losses. So there are many factors that contribute to the yield. And one example is soil type. And overall, statistically, 20% increase better on your best part of your land. So you can imagine the increase in yield on your saline and alkali areas on your farm. I've had a lot of people ask me what happens when conditions get dry. What does tiling a field do to your land? Well, now that profile has now become like a sponge, when it comes end of July, August, when we generally get less rain, the roots will go deeper now into the soil profile to get those nutrients and the moisture to help improve the yield. And a good example I have of this was there's a grower in Minnesota that I know, and they grow a lot of corn and soybeans. And on his farm, he was tiling his fields at 60-foot laterals with the intention later to come back in at 30 feet. But he just wanted to spend the money on 60 feet at this time. And this particular year, it was very dry about 4 or 5 years ago. And above the tile, his corn was big and healthy. And then it V'd down in between the tile up to the next tile and so forth across the field. And he said the yield that he lost in between the tile and the price of corn that year, it would have paid him to properly tile that field at 30-foot laterals. And so this shows you again that tiling not only can improve the yield and productivity on your farm in wet years, it also does it in the dry years. And like he said, seeing is believing to understand that. Also, Mitch mentioned about infrastructure. Tiling does reduce the pressure on infrastructure downstream, like ditches, culverts, bridges, because of the slow release of water out of the outlets, which is another term really is great water management for tiling. And an example I have for that was actually this year in 2017, in the growing season. We tiled for a customer at South of Souris, and we tiled, his project was just over 800 acres. And we had 4 inches of rain in about 10 days at Souris. And after the first 1.5 inches of rain, I was talking to the client, and he had gone to his field just to see how things looked, and he said he couldn't even tell it rained on his field, but his neighbor's field was starting to get a little bit of pooling. Day 3, we had about another 1.5 inches of rain. He went out to check his field again, and he said, in his low spots, there's just a little bit of glistening, and his neighbors, their potholes were getting quite full by then with 3 inches. And day 10, we had the last inch, and I went out to visit him on day 13 or 14, and we drove from the road across the field. He left a path through his canola field. He had canola on there 3 years previous, and this was his first crop of canola since it was tiled. And when we got to the far end of his 800 acres, which was generally the wettest part of his field, he couldn't believe driving through his path, how the canola, we didn't leave any tracks in the field on this path. There was no water line in the canola field. The canola growth was so much greater, he said, than the previous 3 years. And we got to the far south end, and his neighbors' fields you could just see water everywhere. So we decided to go to the outlets to see what was going on there. And so we pulled up, and we couldn't hear any water running. So we kind of got down to where the outlets were, and yeah, there was water there, but it wasn't very deep, maybe a couple inches deep, and I could hardly tell it was moving. So I got down closer, and I could see the algae from the bottom of the outlet to the surface just wiggling so slightly, pointing downstream. So I knew there was water movement, but it just shows you how slow the water movement is out of these systems. It isn't like it rains and goes into the soil and just goes directly out. It goes out very slowly, so it just shows you that pressure downstream on infrastructure is very slight, and who knows, maybe we get enough land tiled in our RMs, maybe the RMs will think about maybe keeping taxes flat on land, or maybe reducing if they don't have to do a bunch of infrastructure rebuilding. So again, just shows you how tiling is a great water management tool. So I'm going to get into the process of what Frontier does when a client contacts us about tiling. So the first thing we do is we fill out a form that we have for mapping. So we go over the form with the client, he signs it. Then we look at where the water downstream is going, and we need to contact growers downstream for 2 miles, and we need to get their consent form signed off of what we're doing upstream, and we make it clear to them what we're doing, answer any questions, and look after concerns they have. And if they want to see the tile plan, we'll show that to them as well, so they understand what we're doing. Permits are then applied for with water stewardship and the RMs and any provincial bodies that are needed. Well, this is a picture that's painted after the mapping is done. It shows the elevation, and the lowest point in this field is the red, and that is where the outlet will be. We use ground vehicles, sometimes we use drones, but most recently we're using LiDAR for doing our mapping. It's a light detection imaging done by a pulse, and it's a very accurate process for getting our elevations. When it comes to wetlands or outlets that are maybe a little deeper or hard to read with LiDAR, then we'll go there manually and take those elevations to get the proper accuracy done. Shown here is the elevations data, which is collected from the field, and then it's downloaded into a specialized computer program. It analyzes it and helps design the system. All systems are designed and regulated through permitting with water stewardship standards. And before we submit our final copy to water stewardship, we go over it with the client and critique it and answer any questions he might have. And then we get the water stewardship's final approval. So when we arrive at a field, the tile crew usually takes some elevation just to check things. They do some flagging, and then the first installation that is done is the outlet and the main line and sub-main lines. These are a very important part of the project. They're the most time-consuming part of the project, and they're the most expensive part of the project. If this isn't done properly, then the whole project can be jeopardized. So it's important to do some checks on this when they get to the field. Lateral lines are installed at 2.5 to 3 feet deep. This really depends on the soil type and the saline levels in the soil. As you get saline levels, you want to tighten up your spacing on your lateral lines, because that'll help reduce the salts in your soil quicker. So how close the space we do in those areas depends on the client and how much he wants to spend on his project. On this particular field, we mapped 260 acres and it was designed for 260 acres. We installed the main lines for the 260 acres. So when the client decides to come back and do the last 100 acres of this project, we can come back and do that without having to adjust the main lines and cause any kind of increase for the client. So it's very, very project specific on how things are done with our clients. When it comes to pipe sizing, the crew takes soil samples from the field. They also look at soil maps for the area. These are discussed with the pipe manufacturer, and that helps to decide the perforation sizing in the pipe and also the pipe sizes for the project. All of our machines are GPS and RTK controlled. Shown here is our plow. We have a WOPE 540 plow on your right here, on your left here. You're on your left here, sorry. And actually that plow is sitting outside the curling club doors. When you come to that entrance, that's our plow sitting there. And the other picture is a picture of our Wolverine rotary ditcher, which is used for surface work. We also have excavators, dozers, trench filler as well. And generally we have 4 to 6 people on our crew working at one time. So subsurface drainage, hashtag water management, it needs to work most times with surface drainage. And this is a picture of our Wolverine doing some surface drainage here. We can do the permitting and the design and the work for a customer, but generally we leave the surface drainage work up to the customer, the client, to do that on his own. If he has the proper equipment, he can do that. All systems are designed, again, with water stewardship standards and regulations to help conserve soil conservation on the fields. And lastly, what we do is before the contract is signed by the customer, it's reviewed with them, and any questions are answered before a deposit is made, and we both sign the contract with the client. Ourselves and the client keep a contract. So this has been McColl's notes on tile drainage. We have a booth located on the curling knife surface. Come visit Brian and Trina and Ron. And Justin, Tyler may also be there. They also work on the crew. It'd be great to meet them and answer any questions. Thank you for your time. You can follow us on Twitter. Those are our Twitter accounts. And we look forward to unlocking your field's potential. Thank you.
Alrighty, thank you, Todd. That is judging by your stance, I was standing too close to the mic earlier, so apologies for that if that was a bit much. How's that sound? Scott has approved my technique. He's the guy who should know. All right, so that is the installer's perspective. Next we'll have Aaron Hargreaves with the grower perspective.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to say thank you to Mitchell for the nice introduction. He's a pretty awesome speaker up here. I probably will not be. So if I start to sound like our Prime Minister answering questions from the Ethics Commissioner, I apologize. So what got us started was 2011. Our crop was very poor. Only got 2/3 of it in, and what we did get in drowned out. So our canola yields were low 20s, and obviously not going to do too well on that. So started looking into tile drainage just on the internet and listening to what the Americans and the guys from Southern Ontario had to say about it. And it looked like it was the answer. The one thing we did notice in 2011 was despite all the rain earlier in the year, it was the drought in late July that really finished our canola off. Our roots looked like pancakes. They went down about this deep, 6 inches down. Our soil profile is pure mud. But at the end of the day, our canola had really droughted out. Salinity, with all the wet years, was getting bigger. I'm sure you guys have noticed it on all your farms as well. It's spreading, it's getting worse, and it's starting to cost us a lot of money. We tried to tackle that problem with variable rate just by cutting out the fertilizer in those areas to try to minimize losses. Ultimately, I guess we just weren't happy enough with how that was going. Land prices were increasing. $1,000 an acre to tile drain your land, it is a lot of money. And if you can buy land for $1,000 an acre, it's kind of hard to justify putting in tile. So as land prices moved up with the big run up in corn and eventually everything else, it made tile drainage become more economically feasible. The picture isn't showing up too great, but this is the field south of Brandon. You can see all these black areas. This is all salinity. It wasn't drowned out. The picture is August 18th, 2013. So we would have tiled this field this fall, and you can see all the salinity. There's some more drown out here. This is not, but this is a creek here, but all this black stuff in the field is salinity, where that crop just was unable to grow. And of course, there's other reasons to tile. We've all experienced this over the years as well, and it can be expensive. You know, the damage to your equipment, not to mention the time that's wasted. So we jumped into tile drainage. We bought a plow and stringer trailer, the GPS units, everything you need to get started. The backhoe we had to buy, trailer for hauling tile. We already had the tractors. We did have to go to RTK, and you need 4 people at your busiest time of year, which is typically harvest, which makes getting custom guys in pretty attractive. At the time, we weren't really aware of too many custom guys in the province. It was pretty new. We thought we could do it ourselves. We were trying to save some money, and you definitely can, but like I say, it's a big time constraint, and you're already busy doing many other things. There's a picture of our backhoe, and that's the stringer trailer right there. Pretty simple, really. You need a survey vehicle. I don't recommend getting one of those. That was the very first day. We didn't get one field done. And yeah, you can take GPS equipment out of something like that very fast in that situation. And I definitely recommend using the LiDAR or something else, at least a diesel engine in something. And for any of you who don't know, you do not have insurance on those under your farm blanket because you can put a license plate on them. So just a heads up. This is a field of the mapping we did ourselves. You can see the curve in the field. That's the railroad tracks. This field is by Nesbitt. And it's hard to show up, but there's a bunch of laterals running here. And then the main just went down here to a creek. And the railroad tracks were causing salinity, as roads and railroad tracks tend to do, and it was also holding back water. And once we got that tiled, it really fixed that field up. So installation, here's a picture of the plow putting in an 8-inch main. This is obviously another very wet fall. You can see the water in the background as we're running right alongside. And this is, when you dig down to the main with the backhoe, how you want it to look. This would be running slightly uphill. Here's your main, and you can see the 4-inch, they're called tap T, where you would hook on the 4-inch lateral once you get the tile plow back in there. And once you're done, you get to watch your investment pay off. And this is water coming out of the tile. This would be the second day after a rain. You see how fast it's running, and it's really not too fast. By the end of the third day, it's usually right down to a trickle. So, 3 days after rain, the tile is usually stopped, and if it's not stopped, it is literally just barely trickling out of there. But it is nice to see once you've done all that hard work, and it is hard work. It's nice to see your investment paying off. So here we are at this field again. Maybe we can, I guess it would be pretty dark if we turned out the last set of lights, but you can see all the salinity here. This is a cloud, this white, and here we are this fall, so it would be 4 years later, similar date, and that was the field. So the salinity is essentially gone, and it was canola this fall, and it was an awesome crop. So anyone who was not sure and maybe didn't believe that it can solve salinity issues, it definitely can. We've seen it on our farm. The only thing I will say is that the tile has to be a minimum of 3 feet deep to solve the issue. Anything shallower than that, and it will not. You'll get crop growing right above the tile, but it will not solve the issue of getting the water table low enough for rains to wash the salts down. And we have many fields where we have the tile not deep enough because outlets can be difficult in your saline areas. They are obviously the lowest part of your field, and you need an outlet that is 3 feet below that, which can be challenging. So therefore, you are stuck with doing lift stations. They're very expensive. For smaller acres, some guys are doing solar panel lift stations now, which is another option, but you're not gonna run 160 acres or anything like that through solar panels. Of course, your other option would be to try to run your main further down the creek until you can get enough depth to make it work. But for anyone trying to drain saline areas, it has to be 3 feet deep, or you're just throwing your money away. There's a steep learning curve. For us, we really didn't know what we were doing when we started from the research, and we sent a couple guys to that school down in North Dakota. But when we actually got out in the field, there's a pretty good learning curve. We learned that if you hit the main, which is here and here with your backhoe, and you don't have 8-inch pipe to fix it, if you come back the next day, there's a good chance that there's going to be 8 inches of water sitting in this hole, and when you jump down into the clay, you'll probably sink up to your knees. So that was a learning lesson for us. And in this situation here, the main broke. The tile plow was running 6.5 feet deep through a hill. Some dirt got in, snapped the main, and we had to dig down to find the main, and we had to dig out this hole wide enough to back the whole tractor up into there. We literally spent a whole entire day just running this one main and fixing this problem. So here you are in the middle of harvest, and yeah, you're spending a whole day with extra guys, trying to do something like this. It can be a little bit frustrating. So it's not easy. You'll definitely have mistakes if you were to try it yourself. And the challenges of tile draining. Obviously, public perception of any drainage, especially at this time, it seems, is getting worse and worse. There is environmental concerns for nitrogen loss. It has shown that nitrogen loss on tiled fields combined with tile and the surface runoff is about 3% higher than non-tiled fields. So that is a concern. They are working on ways to address it. 85% of the losses do occur between fall and spring. So, maybe just putting your nitrogen on in the spring or during when the crop is growing would solve that problem. The research shows that it does. Downstream landowners' permission. In this province, you need 2 miles of downstream landowners' permission. Obviously, all of us farmers are in competition with one another. Maybe we don't like to admit it or think like that, but we are. And there are certain situations where you may not get permission from a downstream landowner's permission, and it may have nothing to do with the water. Certainly a problem we have encountered, and I know many other people that have encountered the same thing. And some of it could just be fear of the unknown. Tile drainage is really new here. People don't know exactly how it works. They're scared. They don't want water running across their land all the time. And certainly, if it's not going down a grass runway, it would be a problem. Wetland protection distances, I think, need to be looked at a little closer. Right now, we're 150 feet, which is probably a reasonable distance to be away on a sandy soil. In Minnesota, on a heavy clay or a clay loam, it's 50 feet. At 150 feet, around those wetlands, it's hard to solve any problems that the wetlands are causing when you have to be 150 feet away. So I definitely think they need to look at the soil type and make the distances according to soil type. Permit wait times, sometimes they're really good. Sometimes they can drag on. It just depends on the job and stuff. New regulations, I'm not 100% sure how exactly they are going to work, or there's new ones just came out. I'm not that familiar with them, but typically drainage rules don't get any better in Manitoba. CAP seems to think they are, but I don't really think anyone else is seeing that. And tile on manured fields, they're making it difficult to tile fields that get manure, and I think that is the wrong thing to do because it just leads to more surface runoff, and obviously phosphate moves with the soil, so we're going to have the highest levels of phosphate in fields that aren't able to be tiled. We're going to have more surface runoff, and of course we all know we have problems with phosphate in this province. Environmental benefits, surface runoff reduced by 65%. Peak water flows 20 to 87. I think that's fairly significant if you have culverts and roads that are getting washed out every 3 years. Sediment loss is reduced by 55%. Sediment is phosphate. We all know that phosphate in Lake Winnipeg is a huge concern, in all the lakes really, in Manitoba, Clarny. I'm sure everyone has a lake in their backyard that's becoming greener by the year. Pesticide losses also, that binds to the soil. Anytime soil is moving off your field, you're losing phosphate, you're losing nitrogen, pesticides. It's much better to have that water filtrating down through the soil, through 3 feet of soil, where by the time it gets down there, it is much cleaner water. I have drank water coming out of a drain tile on our farm before. Probably wouldn't recommend it in large amounts, but it tasted great, and it was perfectly clean. I put it in a glass, or not a glass, but a plastic water bottle, and there's no dirt in it. It is perfectly clean water. So in a study done in New York, 7.5% of the total rainfall was removed through the field through tile. So that was total rainfall for the year. I'm not sure what they get in New York. I'm sure it's a lot more than we get here, but just to show that tile isn't removing huge amounts of water. And University of Waterloo found little to no effects on stream flow in a study from 1949 to 1980. So we're not talking a 1 or 2 year study during a drought here. We're talking about a 31-year study that showed that there was virtually no effects of stream flow due to tile drainage. Obviously very friendly for flooding. Economic benefits. Todd talked a lot about the ones on the farm. Provincially, on the farm, there's economic benefits everywhere. This just shows that in 4 wet years, 5.9 million acres were too wet to seed. That's just Manitoba. In those same 3 years, more acres were drowned out. And the total economic loss was estimated at $7.3 billion for the province. So that's not just farmers, that's, hauling grain, fertilizer, not going into the ground, total economic loss. And that's not even counting the economic gains during all the good years. So we've seen on our farm, our tiled fields always yield more than non-tiled fields. It's good for everybody, it's good for us, it's good for the fertilizer manufacturers, it's good for the guys that haul grain, it's good for the elevators, the economic benefits. Obviously money gets spent quite a few times. And there's just the math. And it's, I use very modest numbers, 10% yield increase. You're probably getting more than that. In some years, you're going to get, from 20 bushel canola, you'd probably end up with 50 bushel canola. Right? So it can be way bigger than that, but with very modest numbers, you're looking $40 net profit without tile, and with tile, $80 net profit. You guys are going to say, well, that's not very much money. Well, how else can you double your net profit on the farm? You can buy more land, $4,000 an acre, and then you got to go buy more seeders, more combines, you have twice as much work, maybe hire a few people. If you can double your net profit by putting tile in the ground, something that is very low maintenance, it's the no-brainer, really. And like I said, on wet years, bad years, it's going to be way more than that. The field I showed you there, in those real saline acres, we've gone from 0 yield. Those creeks were 80 feet wide. They're nothing but black dirt and kochia. And now the yield monitor didn't dip below 60 bushels an acre in those areas. So obviously in worse soils, the economic benefit is going to pay off much sooner. There is economic benefit to tiling whole entire fields. It's going to take a little bit longer. but certainly it is there. I just want to say thank you to Ag Days and to everyone here for listening to me and letting me have this opportunity to speak. Thank you to Simon Knutson at Vantage for providing me with the pictures of the fields. And I guess that is it for me, so thank you very much.
Right, excellent. Thank you for the farmer perspective, Aaron. And now I'm going to spend just a few minutes dispelling one of the myths that has persisted for quite some time, maybe is less so now, and this pertains to Jeanette's role here as Water Resource Officer with Sustainable Development, and the myth being that this is not a regulated practice. If there's one thing we do well in Manitoba, compared to certain other jurisdictions anyway, we regulate quite vigorously in some cases. And this is no exception. By contrast, for interest's sake, in Ontario, it's quite a different approach. It's more of an enabling kind of legislative system or approach, and what's licensed rather than projects are the installers and the equipment that they use. And so briefly, before I invite questions and comments from the audience, I'll touch upon the roles of the various players when it comes to water management in Manitoba and tile drainage in particular. As I mentioned earlier, we have an interdepartmental working group with representation from infrastructure, agriculture and sustainable development, of course, but also municipal relations. And mainly we're trying to establish better lines and have established better lines of communications between our departments and encourage learning experiences like this, taking part in a coordinated kind of approach to get the news out there, get the nerdy knowledge in people's heads so they can make better decisions, have a more balanced view. So to begin, what is the role of local government? The municipality definitely has a role to play here in this water management topic. RMs have the authority to pass bylaws on tile drainage as part of drainage generally. And there's the particular passage in the Municipal Act, for those of you interested in the specific words of the legislation. And a quick advertisement, a new tool is under development. It's in the final stages. It's a project led by the Red River Basin Commission with contributions from folks like Jeanette and myself and the province and conservation districts. And that's a template for RMs to use to devise their own bylaws. So that is coming soon. In terms of breaking down municipal versus provincial authority, the province is responsible for regulating the environmental aspects of development generally, and that includes other topics like manure management, for instance. Municipal bylaws should focus then on the municipal aspects of development specifically, and should not be inconsistent with provincial legislation, so they work well together, they dovetail rather than oppose. A municipality is responsible for enforcing its own bylaws, of course, and the province supports those bylaws by ensuring that municipal approval exists prior to the issuance of a provincial water rights license. So what are the rules specifically that apply in Manitoba via the various actors? Well, the principal piece is the Water Rights Act, and that pertains to water use and management in various forms. The Water Rights Act states that no person shall control water or construct, establish, or maintain any water control works unless he or she has a valid and subsisting license to do so. And that includes tile drainage. Water control works are defined as a whole bunch of stuff. So I'll just allow you folks to breeze through that with your eyes and pick out any useful nuggets that could apply to you. And any of these activities then prompts the requirement of a water rights license to construct water control works. A completed license application along with the license fee must be submitted to Manitoba Sustainable Development, formerly known as Water Stewardship. What are some specific requirements of project licensing for tile drainage? Well, Sustainable Development requires the following technical information in order for a water rights license to be issued. For instance, this isn't necessarily utterly inclusive or exhaustive. Legal location, as you might expect, the number of acres to be tiled, the location of lateral pipe and header pipe, as well as the size, Note the restriction regarding perforation or the lack thereof when it's required, and the location of the outlet, of course. The water has to have a place to go. The proposed tile drainage network details must also include the proposed runoff coefficient. The drainage coefficient is also known as. And that is essentially expressing just how intensive the drainage is, how much water is going to be sent off the land, and there is a provincial cap to that. As well, in acceptable units, what's the proposed or expected discharge rate? In addition, flow control structures may be required on an outlet pipe, and this was mentioned by Aaron. Extra measures, sometimes like lift stations, are required, and there are certain specifics regarding those outlets as well. In the interest of time, I'll move on to the next one. And of course, location of neighbors was mentioned by Aaron and Todd. This is a key consideration. Depends on where the water is going. If the water is going to affect a given party, if it's a municipality or a neighbor, then the written approvals, the notifications and approvals are required. So sometimes multiple approvals are in the mix here, and that could pertain to the province as well in terms of provincial drains and the highway network. So if multiple approvals are required, this and there could be some negotiation involved. Yeah, this could be a lengthy, critical step. It's all very scenario dependent. A mention was made by Aaron of wetlands, and there's a specific setback requirement, and here's an example of a project where non-perforated pipe was established near the wetland in order to avoid affecting it. In terms of regulatory changes, that was mentioned by Aaron, potential for a new regime. Here are some of the new considerations that are part of the mix as a part of recent announcements. There's a bill before the House right now that's reached second reading, I'm told, and so that could capture some of these new elements. And one of the main objectives is streamlining the process and accelerating it. So with that, as you can tell, it is a regulated practice. It is definitely a consideration, and partnership is the key, and sometimes the installers or folks like ourselves can help to facilitate that process. With that, I would like to take advantage of the final 10 or so minutes that we have. Since we have such a well-informed panel here, I would invite you now, let's see. How was that technique? Was that pretty good, Scott? Yeah, good. All right, so I've got the mic here. Based on the range of the signal here, what I've been advised by Scott to do is to receive your questions, and then I'll repeat them, and I'll direct them to the appropriate panel member. And as you can probably guess, when you've got someone like me here running the show, I came prepared with my own questions for them. So there will not be dead air here, because Rangui cannot have dead air at an exciting extension event like this, right? Learning opportunity, but it's first right of refusal to you folks in the crowd. Please raise your arm or gesture otherwise, outrageously or not. Yes, sir, if you would like to bellow out your question, I'll repeat it. The question is regarding the discharge water from tile pipe. Is there a testing regime in place, any mandatory testing for contaminants? Sounds like a regulatory question, and so, Jeanette, your time to shine, please, if you would.
Currently, no. There's no requirements.
Just a moment. We'll let Todd chime in here for a moment, and then I'll follow up with you.
I'd just like to add something to that. I listen to the Rural Ag radio channel a lot on the Sirius XM radio. It's a very good channel to listen to for different topics, and often they have on there discussions on tile drainage. And one time I was listening while I was driving, and there's a grower from Iowa, and he had done tiling for several years, and he tests his water. He was talking about testing his water down there. And he tests for salts, he tests for nutrient runoffs, and he was saying from the first year since he started testing, and this is probably 7 years in, he said every year the saline, the salts, and the nutrients have all decreased in that water volume coming out since he started testing. So, and that's very interesting to note, because yeah, you do get a lot of questions like you're asking about that topic, and it was interesting to hear that from a grower that actually does testing every year.
Did you have a follow-up? Yeah, you're definitely onto it. Two things. One caution, of course, is to make sure that we have a proper comparison, because as I mentioned, the surface flows would already be having an impact if that was business as usual. So it's important to have a proper comparison as opposed to only sampling one scenario versus the other. And I invite you to stick around for Dr. Lobb's presentation, because he may be able to offer you some extra insight in that regard. So thank you for advertising the latter part of the session. All right. Yes, sir? Okay. Yes, very good practical question. This is regarding lifespan, and this is probably going to go to Todd first at least. Lifespan of tile pipe, but Aaron may choose to chime in, and the role of the so-called sock.
Okay, for a start off with the sock, we generally don't use sock on our pipe unless it's necessary because of the soil type. So the sandier the soil, then we look at adding the sock to the pipe, because that sock does do a tremendous increase on the cost of the pipe per acre. So like I mentioned earlier, we do take soil samples, and our Brian or Trina do send that down to the pipe manufacturer, I believe, and they look at that and they decide from there whether a sock is needed or not. And coming to the lifetime of the pipe, I guess that's a question really for the pipe manufacturer, but right now it's decades really on that pipe. The quality of pipe has been getting better from it was, I would say, previous 10 or 20 years ago, and innovations are always improving, so really we don't have any concerns about the pipe not lasting the lifetime of a grower, and I don't know if Aaron has anything else to add to that.
I do know that in areas like southern Minnesota and stuff, there is tile that has been installed for 50, 80 years. It's still working today. As long as it's installed properly, if you have enough grade on the tile, the water will flush. If any dirt happens to get in it, it'll flush it out if that happened to be the case. If the tile is too flat, it can eventually over the years fill up with a bit of sediment after 20 years or something like that. But typically, if it's installed properly, it should last a long, long time.
So as not to show any bias, there is one, this side of the room. Please go ahead.
Is tile, does it have any effect on soil compaction? Can it alleviate compaction, or does it do anything?
The question is regarding another soil quality concern. We talked about salinity earlier. This is about compaction. Does tile drainage alleviate soil compaction? Todd?
I guess you might have missed my presentation, but yeah, I mentioned in my presentation that it does alleviate soil compaction immensely, and the roots can penetrate deeper into the soil profile. Like that profile becomes more like a sponge and more airable, more breathable, and the roots will go deeper. And it is a very effective way of relieving that soil compaction. Yes.
Oh, there you are. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
On the outlet of the tile drainage, what is the reason for having that 3 feet underground? And how on earth do you get water to run out of that pipe, and what happens when it freezes?
All right, this is the question about the outlet and managing the water at that point in terms of the depth required to get the water moving, and concern about freezing as winter arrives. Aaron, any thoughts?
So yeah, the pipe has to be 3 feet underground. Now, if you go, because your pipe can run at a very low grade, 1 inch every 100 feet. If you run it longer, you can get it shallower, but definitely freezing, it does happen. You want a good outlet, so when your tile, the water runs out of the tile, the water's running away, and if that happens, then your tile will not freeze up. But if it does happen to freeze up, then it does take some time in the spring to thaw out. And typically that's why tile helps prevent flooding, is because it does not thaw out as early as the spring runoff would be. So if the spring runoff happened in mid to early April, it could be 3 weeks later before your tile thaws out enough to start working. So that, it's very good for flood prevention, especially in this province, because of that reason. Are you worried about ditches and stuff freezing up? I'm not sure.
I'm concerned about getting water out of that pipe if it's 3 feet underground. You're going to back up water until it's seeping out of the ground.
Yeah, ideally, when the water comes out of the pipe, it should be flowing away. And that way, the tile will run because it stays thawed out for a long time. It'll be into December and your tile could still be running. And at that point, of course, there's no more water going to be going into the tile because it's frozen on top. So the tile should get a chance to completely empty itself out before winter really sets in. We've had water freeze in some tiles in certain situations, and you just have to wait. It's just like having no tile in the field at that point until it thaws out. So,
Gentleman over here.
Down in Iowa, they've been doing this for quite a number of years, and some of the systems they're putting in is a central collection facility to be able to do backwater and underground irrigation. Have you guys been familiar with any of those systems?
The question is regarding more intensive management or alternatives that involve recycling the water back through. Sub-irrigation is one term for that. Would someone here like to comment on prospects for that practice here?
We currently have an interdepartmental group that's looking at all those possibilities. Sub-irrigation is definitely one that we're looking at.
Yeah, it is something that demands a higher level of management, and there's a cost element to it, of course, but in light of the conditions we saw in 2017, it's illustrating a need to provide water as much as get rid of it in this province, as we know, depending on the year. Yes, sir.
Yes. Manure spread on tile drain fields was briefly mentioned. Is it legal to spread manure, livestock manure on fields that receive tile drains?
Okay, as a warning, this might have to be our final question before we switch to the next presenter. And so, Jeanette, this is the question regarding the legality of the application of manure on tile drain fields.
Yes, it is legal to do that. In some municipalities, though, they have passed a bylaw, and that's currently being looked at because the manure spreading is a provincial regulated thing, and it should have been the province that would have put that ban on. So in some municipalities, they are not allowing it currently, but the province does allow manure spreading on tile fields.
Okay, with that one supplemental, Mr. English, because we have to switch to the next speaker. If Dr. Alan Preston's in the office, could you please, in the house, could you please come forward, Dr. Preston?
Made of surface inlets to subsurface drainage system. Is that legal? Are you legally allowed to install a surface inlet into a subsurface drainage system?
The question is the legality of surface inlets connecting with subsurface drainage networks. Jeanette?
As long as the plan is there and we see it and it's valid and it's not nuking a wetland, then we would allow subsurface to go into, surface runoff to go into subsurface drainage.
You have a minute to switch over? Okay, Scott needs a minute to switch over, so in light of the topic, I'll allow one more question. Granted, we've got quite a bit of ruckus in the room now, but if there's one more urgent question. Yes, go ahead. The question is regarding the cap of 3/8 inch drainage coefficient that I identified in one of the slides regarding regulation in Manitoba. Jeanette, could you comment on that 3/8 inch cap? The wording was should not exceed 3/8 inch, by the way. The word should was on the slide. Go ahead, Jeanette.
It is a...
You can use this one. There you are.
That's to protect the infrastructure, we limit. It does say should, so if there is a case where you have downstream landowner approval that would allow you to go over the 3/8 and the municipality agrees, then we would look at that.
All right, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our esteemed panel. Could you join me with a round of applause for their contribution to Ag Days this year?
Thanks for tuning in to the Manitoba Ag Days podcast. We'll see you next year from January 22nd to 24th, 2019.